In Los Angeles, Charles Manson went to court today.
Ted Bundy, a Washington state resident, convicted last year of the kidnap assault of a young woman.
Via photos of mutilated bodies and body parts strewn across the apartment. He even had a vat of acid he used to dispose of victims. In all, Dahmer killed 17 people, mostly young men of color.
The man suspected of attacking at least 4 people with a hammer.
In the street, I heard about 3 gunshots.
Attackers on a Brooklyn street. The victim says the brutal assault seemed to have no motive.
Oh, look at that. Terrible. And there's no police presence down here.
Why is the world such a chaotic mess? If you were to ask the average believer today, why is there so much evil and chaos in our world? They would typically point to the events of Genesis 3, the fall of mankind. But if you were to ask the same question to a first century Jew, you would get a completely different answer. An ancient person would not isolate the totality of sin, death, and human depravity to just the events that occurred in the garden. No doubt it's obvious that what happened in Genesis 3 is responsible for the entrance of evil in our world, along with death and eternal separation from God. But a first century Jew would say there are actually 3 reasons why the world is such a mess. Genesis 3, 6, and 11 all contain a supernatural element that is connected to human events, and when interpreted in context, provide insight into the origins of idolatry, depravity, and human self-destruction. Today's believer doesn't see it because we lack the original ancient context. Who are the sons of God in Genesis 6:2? What about the Nephilim in verse 4? And how are these verses connected to the wickedness of man in verse 5? And what does the Tower of Babel have to do with any of this? Biblical writers had a supernatural worldview that often dipped into ancient Mesopotamian culture. This culture and its literature were often referenced in their writings. Indeed, an important key for understanding why the world is such a chaotic mess is taking into account the original context of Genesis 6, 1 through 4, and its ancient Mesopotamian backstory. This context runs throughout the Old Testament and into the New, connecting dots between strange passages and concepts that are commonly overlooked or dismissed. When laid out in full view, these threads reveal a portrait of the Messiah that is often missed by today's church, a portrait that the Old Testament writers intended for us to see.
Doctor, earlier we talked about supernatural beings and sons of God. Are the individuals in Genesis 6, 1 through 4, are they supernatural beings also?
Yeah, I believe they are. I think sons of God there ought to be taken the same way. You know, in short terms, if you take the Hebrew phrase B'nai Elohim or B'nai Ha Elohim, those are the 2 ways that Hebrew expresses sons of God. Everywhere else in the Hebrew Bible, those precise phrases refer to supernatural beings. And so I see no reason why in Genesis 6, really verse 2 and verse 4, I see no reason why we should exempt that meaning in that passage. Now, having said that, I'll admit that a lot of people, really the dominant view in the church, has been to deny that. Other explanations for the sons of God, they can't be supernatural beings. For a lot of people, it's just too weird, what happens in the passage.
Well, why does it matter whether they're supernatural beings or not?
I think it matters for a number of reasons. I mean, this is a pretty strange passage. It's pretty obscure. but it actually sort of bleeds into some other things that make it more important. And it's not just because, any sort of stripping away of the supernatural nature of the sons of God really doesn't work. I mean, you'll often see, again, this is the dominant view in the church, that the sons of God here are just people, of some variety. It doesn't really explain, how we get Nephilim out of that. It also, sort of isolates, the women, the daughters of men, to being the bad people in the ancient world. The sons of God are good people, and we shouldn't get married. Bad people and good people shouldn't get married. It just doesn't make a whole lot of sense. But I think there's even a more fundamental reason. For me personally, I think where Genesis 6 is sort of situated in the wider worldview, plus what Peter, specifically 2 Peter, does with the passage, are really the two reasons why I think it's important. Now, let me just try to sketch out the first of those, and I'll make reference to the Peter issue. If you ask the average, believer, Bible study, person, somebody who's serious about Scripture, hey, why is the world the mess that it is? Why is it just such a chaotic mess? The answer you'll typically get is the fall. Okay, what happens in Genesis 3, Adam and Eve and the serpent. But if you ask the same question to a first century Jew or a literate biblical Israelite, toward the end of the Old Testament period, why is the world such a mess? That is not the answer you would get. And we know that because they actually discuss that question. The answer you would get from an ancient person in either of those contexts is, well, there's actually three reasons why the world is so bad, why it is what it is. The first reason is what happens in Genesis 3 in Eden. Okay, it's obvious. We've got evil enter the world. We've got the death problem now. Humans are estranged from God. They're going to die. The supernatural rebel is cast down to the earth and the underworld. Now we have an underworld because that's the realm of the dead, because we have death, all that bad stuff. There's a second problem, and that's the Genesis 6, 1-4 passage, which ancient Judaism universally associated with the proliferation of depravity on earth. Now, that sounds really kind of weird, to our ear, because we can read Genesis 6, 1-4. We might as well do that, just sort of to get it in our heads. When man began to multiply on the face of the land and daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw that the daughters of man were attractive, and they took as their wives any they chose. Then the Lord said, My spirit shall not abide in man forever, for he is flesh, his days shall be 120 years. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God came into the daughters of men, and they bore children to them. These were the mighty men of old, the men of renown. Now, if you just stop there, you'd wonder, well, what does that have to do with depravity? Okay, the very next verse says, The Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every intention of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. Now, to us, we look at that and we wonder, well, how do we go from all this weird stuff, sons of God and Nephilim, to God looking at humanity and saying, you're just hopelessly corrupt? There are a number of reasons for that, and we may want to unpack those a little bit later, but in the intertestamental period in Judaism, it's very rare to have every Jewish group and Jewish writer sort of agree on something. This is actually one of those things. They all will say that what happens here in Genesis 6, 1-4 with the sons of God contributes to human self-destruction and worldwide depravity. Every one of them. And it's because they saw a relationship between the first 4 verses and Genesis 6:5 that we sort of can't see. And it's really ultimately because we lack the original context for the passage. But they didn't. So that's one reason. We've got, again, a series of answers as to why the world is the mess that it is. We've got the fall, Genesis 3. We've got this, Genesis 6, 1-4. Later on, we're going to have something happen at Babel that's going to fragment humanity. God is going to assign the different nations that he has just sort of divorced himself from to other sons of God. There's that phrase again, sons of God, according to Deuteronomy 32, 8, and 9. And that's going to create a situation that, I would say, devolves into idolatry and chaos in the nations. We know from Psalm 82, this is precisely what the gods of the nations are being judged for. So we've got really three reasons why the world is a mess. And Genesis 6 is part of that. And if you sort of don't see that, and there are reasons why the church historically hasn't seen the Babel incident as well, it has to do with the Dead Sea Scrolls, you really sort of lose the magnitude of the problem. And I would say, more importantly, if you believe this as an ancient person, that there are these three reasons why the world is a mess, if that's really what's inside your head, then you're also thinking, well, when the Messiah shows up, he's going to address all three, not just the first one. And if you realize that, there are going to be things in the New Testament, places Jesus goes in the Gospels, things he says once he's there, different sign acts, different episodes, different statements in the epistles that actually link back into one of these three, not just the first one, but one of these three. There are three threads that go all the way into the New Testament and get their resolution in the Messiah. So you miss really the portrait of the Messiah that the New Testament writers wanted you to see. And let's just tack Peter on here. If we go to 2 Peter, this is going to be 2 Peter chapter 2. Peter makes a statement there that I think is pretty important that we have to deal with. So in 2 Peter chapter 2, he starts talking about false teachers, verse 1. False prophets also arose among the people, so on and so forth. False teachers among you, bringing in destructive heresies. And of course, that's followed by how these heresies bring human self-destruction. And then, as if to illustrate this, let's look at where he goes. Verse 4, for if God did not spare angels when they sinned, but cast them into hell and committed them to chains of gloomy darkness to be kept until the judgment. If he didn't spare the ancient world, but preserved Noah, the herald of righteousness, with 7 others, and then brought a flood upon the world of the ungodly. So he links the false teaching, human self-destruction, somehow to angels that sinned at the time of the flood in Noah. Well, there's only one candidate for that. At this point, you might have people think, what about a third of the angels that, rebelled with Satan? Again, there's no passage in the entire Bible that actually describes that, actually says it, ever. You get a third of the angels, or a third of the stars in Revelation 12, but that's a quotation of Daniel 8:10. It's actually a defeat of part of the heavenly host by the dragon. It's not a satanic rebellion. So we only have one candidate here, angels, plural, that sinned at the time of the flood. What would that be? Again, it's Genesis 6. So if you want to deny that Genesis 6 is about supernatural sons of God, you have a problem with Peter. It's almost like you're saying that Peter's wrong. And I have a problem with that.
Why would the ancient Jews connect Genesis 6, 1 through 4 with Genesis 6, 5?
Yeah, I mean, if you think about it, the first 4 verses don't seem to have much of a relationship to the 5th one, again, to our reading. The first 4 verses is this weird, sons of God, daughters of men, Nephilim stuff. Well, why is that a commentary? Why does that lead to God's assessment that everybody on earth was only evil in their hearts, at all times? The reason is because we lack a context for this that they had. And that makes all the difference in the world. Now, what I'm going to say here, it really goes back to Mesopotamia. Genesis 6, 1 through 4 actually has a context. It's not something that's just random that, Moses or, if you don't believe in Mosaic authorship, some other writer, it doesn't matter. The writer doesn't just have this pop into his head, I'll append these 4 verses here even though they don't make sense with anything else. Why not? Let's just do that. Okay, there's a purpose to this and there's a reason why it's put right before the flood. In Mesopotamia, there was a story of pre-flood events that parallels Genesis 6, 1 through 4 at every point that we just don't know. And frankly, it's only been since about 2010 that all of the data in cuneiform tablets from Mesopotamia has been collected that informs us of this context. So it really hasn't been a complete picture, since 2010. And I mention that specifically because there are going to be people that you're going to interact with, you're going to talk about this passage with, that are going to bring up commentaries that don't have anything that I'm about to say in them. Look at the copyright. Okay. Anything written before 2010, I can guarantee you it's not going to say anything about this because they just didn't have the data. I used to work at a Bible software company and I had all the commentaries in digital. I actually searched for this. I found 2 references in all of the major commentary series that exist, 2 references to the word apkallu, which is what the original context is. You say, what's apkallu? In Mesopotamia, there was the story of how the chief gods created humans and then got tired of them. They're noisy, they irritate us. Let's send a flood and destroy them. Now, there were lesser gods in the Mesopotamian story called the apkallu. Before the flood, they are deities. They're 100% divine. And I'm saying it that way for a reason that'll become apparent here in a few seconds. The apkallu hear this and they're appalled. Like, we can't let this happen. I mean, this is crazy. We've invested a lot of time in these people because the apkallu were considered by Mesopotamians to be supernatural beings who had come to Earth and given humans technology. Okay, given them information about warfare and metallurgy and the stars, astrology, all this stuff. The body of human knowledge was thought to have been transmitted by these divine beings called the apkallu. Now we don't have the textual information as far as any meeting among them at what they decide to do, but we do have texts about them after the flood. Right after the flood, it says that the apkallu, from that point on, were of human descent. Okay, and there are Mesopotamian scholars that, again, read the tablets and say, okay, this sounds pretty much like Genesis 6, that somehow there was this, intercourse, interbreeding, whatever. Same story as in Genesis 6, 1 through 4. And in the Mesopotamian version, that resulted in the knowledge of the apkallu being passed on to the next human generation after the flood. So that was their means of saving civilization. The apkallu from that point are also described as giants. Gilgamesh is the most famous example. Gilgamesh is referred to as Lord of the Apkallu. And another text has him as a giant, even slightly bigger than Goliath in terms of cubits, okay? So you have all of the elements there. But the key thing that Jewish thinkers focused on was the stuff that these supernatural beings taught humanity. Weapons of warfare, and how to create destructive technology, immorality. Okay, the arts of seduction is how the scribes refer to it. Astrology, idolatry, all this stuff. We know that they knew these texts because in the intertestamental period, there are texts that survive that retell the story in Mesopotamian terms and then apply it to Genesis 6. The Book of Enoch is one of these. There's another book called the Book of the Giants from among the Dead Sea Scrolls that actually names Gilgamesh, by name, and there are a few other giants that are named there as well. So here was the Jewish view. In Enoch, he describes again this rebellion of supernatural beings that transgress heaven and earth. He's retelling the Genesis 6, 1 through 4 story. And he accuses these supernatural beings of teaching humans bad things to more efficiently destroy themselves and become more depraved. If you compare that list to the list in Mesopotamia, the tablets of what the apkallu taught, they match. They align. And so to a Jew, it's like this was horrible. To a Mesopotamian, this is heroic. These guys are the good guys because they saved civilization, and we as Babylonians inherited it. This is why, they are why, Babylon is superior to all civilizations. That's what a Mesopotamian thought. A Jew thought, this is why everybody's corrupt, and Babylon is awful. It's anti-Eden. And so with this backstory in mind, they look at Genesis 6, 1 through 4. They see the story of the sons of God. Again, all the elements are accounted for in the Mesopotamian apkallu story. And then they see that story, and then they see verse 5 and go, yep, you betcha. God saw the wickedness of mankind on the earth. Every thought of the imagination of his heart was only evil continually. They knew why verse 5 connected to the first 4 verses, because they knew the backstory. We don't. Now we do now, Again, because we have the Book of the Giants, okay? We have all of this other Mesopotamian material that scholars have put together since 2010. But when I did my search, back at the software company, I found the word apkallo in 2 commentaries out of dozens. And it wasn't a discussion, it was like in a bibliography. No treatment of the issue at all. No treatment of the backstory, completely without context. And so what I would suggest is that if you're going to read Genesis 6, 1 through 5, we'll loop verse 5 in there, in context, you must account for this material. You must take the backstory into consideration. You loop Peter into that. Again, angels, plural, that sin. It's very obvious how Peter's reading this. And there's one other thing. In the Jewish literature between the Testaments, the term that Enoch and others, the Book of the Watchers, use for the bad guys, the sons of God, who are the apkallu counterparts in the biblical story, the term they use is watchers. In the Mesopotamian material, archaeologists have uncovered figurines of apkallu. Okay? One of the terms used for those figurines is matzare, which in Akkadian means watchers. Okay? It couldn't be more explicit. The identification of the 2 things. This is what they're thinking about. And this is why the passages are connected. When Peter, again, refers to angels that sinned and sent into in chains of gloomy darkness, sent to hell, because a lot of what the translations that we use will say, the Greek verb there is actually tartarao. It means sent to Tartarus. So what's that? In the ancient Greek, outside the Bible, again, all these stories we grew up with, Zeus and all these characters, they actually have a story about titans. Again, divine beings that, again, do the same thing. They get sent as a punishment to the underworld, to Tartarus. Tartarus is the name of the place they get sent. So Peter is actually dipping into the secular Greek version of the same story. Again, everything points in one direction, except for the way the church has historically read it. That's the only outlier here, the tradition that we've grown up with. And I understand, why people are hesitant. It just sounds so weird, like how does it work? And there are ways that we could talk about that, but again, that in a nutshell is what we're dealing with here. That's why they read it the way they did.
So having said that, what is the majority view of the modern church? What do we believe today?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, most churches will take what I would just loosely call a human view. In other words, sons of God are not supernatural beings. And the dominant view there is something called the Sethite view. Now let's just go back to Genesis 6, and I'll walk you through how, again, the majority view in the history of the church would have taken this. And this is a view that emerged just before the time of Augustine or Augustine. So let's just, for round numbers, 4th century AD. Prior to that, everybody read the story, both in terms of Judaism and the ancient secular Greek literature, and the Christians, people like Irenaeus. Okay, they all read it the way I just articulated to you. Supernatural beings, angels that sin. That's Genesis 6. That changed with Augustine and his stature. So out of his time emerged this thing called, the Sethite view. That's the label we use now. So if you go to Genesis 6, when man began to multiply on the face of the land and daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw that the daughters of men were attractive. So in this view, the sons of God specifically are the descendants of the line of Seth. Remember, Adam, Eve had Cain and Abel. Cain kills Abel, and then Seth is born. Okay, Genesis, at the end of Genesis 4, Genesis 5. Since Seth replaced the righteous Abel, it was thought that Seth is the righteous one, and so the sons of God here must be the line of Seth. And that would make the daughters of men non-Sethites. Like all of a sudden they're associated with Cain, the bad guys. Now, you probably already have detected a problem. Why is it that the men of a particular line are good guys and the women are the bad ones? And even even beyond that, what about when we start having other children and other lineages, like only people that could say I'm related to Seth are righteous, that like made them righteous or something? Again, there are gaps in sort of the coherence of the idea, but this is the idea. And so they have, children, and you say, well, what about Nephilim? Like if they're just people, where do you get Nephilim? At this point, it's denied that Nephilim are giants. This is, again, how the view works. You'll hear things like, well, Nephilim means the fallen ones. And it could refer to spiritually fallen or men fallen in battle or something like that. Well, the problem there is if that's what the scribe wanted us to read, we wouldn't see Nephilim, the middle I vowel is important. In the text, we would see Nephulim. That's a passive construction. That would be fallen ones. But that isn't ever what the text has. Some people will say, well, it means warriors. It calls them warriors in the next verse. So maybe it's the Nephilim, from the verb nephal, to fall, means those who fall upon other people, those who, go to battle against other people. Again, if that's what the scribe wanted, he would have spelled it Nophilim. That's an active participle, those who fall upon. That isn't what the text says. And worse than that, the ancient translators, like in the Septuagint, they know what this is. They translate the term gigantes, giants. So if the text said something else, you'd think they would have seen that and translated accordingly. They never, in fact, translate Nephilim, ever, not even in one case, with the Greek word for fall, okay, which is, pipto. You'll never see that. It's always gigantes, giants. Sometimes they'll take the term and transliterate it, Anakim or Enakim, Rephaim or Raphaim, or something like that. They'll sort of stick with the proper name. You'll never find it fallen ones. So you got a significant problem here. Not only that, but the descriptions. Amos 2, 9, and 10 refers to those who are conquered in the land, who descend from the Nephilim by virtue of Numbers 13, 32, and 33. It refers to them as, tall as cedars, exceedingly tall. This is the consistent description you get, which is why the ancient people translated it as gigantes, giants. It was simple to them. They didn't have the Sethite view. So, this is how it's articulated. Again, there are just a number of problems with this. Again, why are the men of Seth the only believers? Like, how does that define a believer? I'm from this or that lineage. Why are the women evil? They're the daughters of Cain. Why do we get these inconsistencies? With Nephilim, why do we have to, again, look at the text and sort of pretend that it doesn't say what it says, again, to make this other view possible? And again, the Peter problem is there. Peter's not reading the passage this way. So you have all sorts of problems, but nevertheless, because of Augustine, because of his stature, this became the dominant view of the early church, and that persists all the way up to today. In today's world, we are post-Enlightenment. We're a scientific society. We also see a lot of Christians rejecting the view that I'm in favor of, the supernatural view, because they wonder, well, how does that work? And when you ask the question, how does it work, sons of God, daughters of men, and producing offspring? When you ask that question, you're actually asking a scientific question. You want to know how mechanically, biologically this works. Again, nobody's asking that question. And frankly, it's sort of a dangerous trajectory, because if I could sit here and say, well, I'll answer that question if you can tell me how the virgin birth works. Give me the biology for that. How does the Trinity work? How does the concept of salvation work? How does the deity of Christ work? How does the incarnation work? Okay, none of these things have scientific, modern, post-Enlightenment, rationalistic answers. They all involve divine beings and what divine beings can do or not do, okay? There's no core item of our faith that can submit, again, to the tools of science like this. So I think it's very inconsistent to ask that question of Genesis 6, 1 through 4, when the answer is really, hey, I don't know how it biologically works. All I know is that God created supernatural beings. Maybe they can do things that we can't, or that we can't understand, okay? Just like these other things. It's very inconsistent to isolate the question to that passage and not ask it of all these really more important ideas: virgin birth, deity of Christ, Trinity, even the concept of salvation. How does that work? Again, if you're looking for a scientific answer, there is none. So why is it, again, that we submit certain passages to this question and not others? And I'm suggesting to you that the biblical writers didn't have this struggle. They assumed that the activity of God and supernatural beings sort of had their own properties, their own abilities. They were divine, they're not human. And so how they worked, or how anything worked, never even entered into their minds. It's a property. This is the domain of the supernatural world. It's not our world. So we just have to deal with that. We just have to let that world be what it is, and our world is what it is too.
Are there any other views that people adopt to avoid the sons of God being supernatural beings?
Yeah, there's something called the, for lack of a better term here, the royal marriages view. And this is the notion that sons of God in the passage refers to kings, okay? Now, it's true, in the ancient world there were, in different cultures, the king would be perceived as a son of the gods, or in Egypt's case, like Pharaoh was considered the incarnation of Horus, specifically. But what you don't get is you never, in any ancient literature, have a group, plural, described as sons of the gods. It's kind of logical, because if you're in a country, you only have one king at a time, okay? So you're never going to have a group. That's one outlier. You also have to ask, well, why would God care if a bunch of kings decided to have harems? Like he's going to send a flood for that? There's no law against it. We don't even have a law. And what's really interesting, if you actually think carefully about the flow of the first 6 chapters of Genesis, right before this, in chapter 5, you get this big long list of genealogies. Okay, now most scholars will be aware that Genesis 5 has some parallel to something called the Sumerian king list. Same thing, long list of genealogies before the flood. What's interesting is that the Sumerian king list has kings, but the biblical list does not. There are no kings in view. So that sort of undermines the whole approach. We don't have a law against it. Okay, if we did have kings somewhere in the culture, again, God's really going to wipe out humanity because some kings decide to have more than one wife? I mean, even biblical figures had more than one wife. God doesn't talk about the disaster, of polygamy, like, oh, I already sent a flood. Well, I got to find another way to destroy the world because you have more than one wife. It just doesn't make any sense. And again, in terms of primary text, there is no text that has a group of human royalty called the sons of God. There are no examples of that. So those are the internal problems. But again, any human view, just like the Sethite view, the major problems it has is it ignores the very clear context of the Apkallu story. Again, the Apkallu story from Mesopotamia accounts for every point of Genesis 6:1 through 5. These views do not. Okay, and it also doesn't account for the way Peter looks at things. So you've got, even with this alternative to the Sethite view, it suffers from the same problems and has problems of its own too.
Dr. Heiser, you said something earlier about the sons of God and the Tower of Babel. Mm-hmm. Are these the same sons of God from Genesis 6?
No, they're not. If you recall what Peter says, again, angels that sinned, again, in the time before the flood associated with Noah, that they were sent, in chains of gloomy darkness. They're sent to Tartarus. So Peter is alluding to this notion that the original offending sons of God of Genesis 6 get imprisoned. They're sent to the abyss, the chains of gloomy darkness. That's actually another element of the Apkallu story that I didn't mention earlier. In the Apkallu story, when the Apkallu do what they do and they preserve civilization after the flood, when they're of human descent and all this, the upper gods, the ones who ordered the flood, look at this and say, what do you think you're doing? I mean, we wanted everything destroyed, and now look at what's going on here. And they actually, in those texts, Marduk is the chief deity at the time, and he says to the Apkallu, now it's time for you to go back to the abyss, and you're never going to come out again. So he actually sends them to the Abzu, to the abyss in Mesopotamian thought. Again, it's another parallel. specifically to what we get in Peter. And in the book of Enoch, the same thing happens. They're thrown into the pit and chained there. Again, it's all very consistent, but again, we don't have the context for a lot of these things. So the sons of God that show up later in relation to the Tower of Babel, these aren't the same guys. This is a different group. They're still called sons of God because they're supernatural beings. And the reference here is actually from Deuteronomy 32, 8 and 9, which often isn't a passage we think of with the Tower of Babel story, but it's actually really important.
I've read the story of the Tower of Babel many times. I don't see any sons of God there.
Yeah, neither did I for many years as well. You're right. If you read Genesis 11, and I think it's the first 9 verses that's the Tower of Babel story, you can read through that whole thing, and we've taught this in Sunday school how many times, or taught it to our kids. And you're right. If you read the Tower of Babel story, there aren't any angels or sons of God there. But the issue is, that isn't the only place in the Bible that alludes to what happens at the Tower of Babel. So if you go over to Deuteronomy 32, 8 and 9, this is part of Moses, sort of his farewell sermon. We hit these 2 verses. So I'm reading from ESV. When the Most High gave to the nations their inheritance, when he divided mankind. Okay, again, we know who the Most High is. Unless there's an alternative Most High, this is the God of the Bible, okay? Same one at the Tower of Babel, where the nations were divided, the peoples are divided into nations. So when the Most High gave the nations their inheritance, when he divided mankind, he fixed the borders of the peoples according to the number of the sons of God. Okay? So right there it is. And then the next verse is equally important. But the Lord's portion, in the Hebrew it's Yahweh, Yahweh's portion is his people, Jacob his allotted heritage or inheritance. You say, what in the world is this? Well, my translation doesn't say that. Some translations don't. Again, I grew up on the King James as a young believer, and it doesn't say sons of God. It says sons of Israel. Okay, so to go back to the passage, when the Most High gave the nations their inheritance, divided mankind, fixed the borders according to the number of the sons of Israel. That's what I grew up with. And a lot of people, that's what their translations will say. Now, the ESV has a little footnote here because it has sons of God, and it tells you in the footnote, this reading comes from the Dead Sea Scrolls. It's also found in the Septuagint. The Septuagint actually says angels of God. That's how it translates the Hebrew B'nai Elohim, which is what the Dead Sea Scrolls have, sons of God. The traditional Hebrew text on which older translations like the King James is based, that Hebrew text has B'nai Yisrael, sons of Israel. It's a different reading. But the Dead Sea Scrolls, again, which is our oldest material for the Hebrew Bible, along with the Septuagint, both of them do not say sons of Israel. They say sons of God, angels, all right? Now that is going to sound really strange, and it sort of begs the question, like, well, what's going on with that? What do we do with that? Okay, it's sons of Israel, or sons of God, not sons of Israel. Of what importance is that? Before we get to that, I do want to add one other note. It's good to look at your footnotes in your study Bibles. What if you don't have a study Bible? Does that mean you have to have a knowledge of the Hebrew text and be a textual critic, to study your Bible and know what it says? No. Just think a little bit about what the passage says. Tower of Babel. Okay? Nations get divided, get really, this is their heritage, this is their ancestry. Genesis 10, you get the list of nations called the Table of Nations. Then you get the Tower of Babel story that tells us how we got that list. Who's not in the list? Israel. If you read through Genesis 10, Israel doesn't exist yet. And so that alone should tell you that sons of Israel doesn't make any sense here. Okay, some scribe along the way put that in there. But we inherit it as the traditional text. It was only after the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered that we find out what the original text actually said. And you've probably heard a lot about the Dead Sea Scrolls, how important they are for biblical studies. This is a good example. It actually restores the original text. And your modern translations, like the ESV, will put footnotes in there when it matters. When they can make a correction or update the text and explain that, okay, we're using the Dead Sea Scrolls here. This is why we're translating it the way we have. So it's really important. But again, going back to the whole episode, what does it mean? What does it mean?
So why is all of this so important that we understand evil in the world today?
Yeah, this is as I mentioned earlier, this is the third explanation for why the world is the mess that it is, why we have evil in both spheres, supernaturally and on the human level. I think the best short path to answering this question is to say something like, well, it's important because of Daniel 10. And I say it that way because Daniel 10 is much more familiar to the average Bible student. Remember Daniel 10, where we have these characters called the Prince of Persia and the Prince of Greece, and these supernatural figures behind or attached to these nations that are, opposing Michael. And again, you can read that and you sort of know that, okay, we've got spiritual warfare here. We've got divine beings that somehow have an attachment to geopolitical empires, Persia, Greece, and whatnot. Well, you need to go from that, just reading that passage, to asking a simple question that often isn't asked, and that is, where does Daniel get this idea? Well, the answer is, he gets it from Deuteronomy 32, 8, and 9. There really isn't any other passage other than what I'm going to go through here real quickly in Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy 32, 8, 9 is the most clear. Again, if you're reading with the Dead Sea Scrolls, that at the Tower of Babel, think of it this way. The Tower of Babel is after the flood. God has sworn, I'm never going to do this flood thing again. Okay, it was just a disaster, and it was just awful. But we're not going to do that again. So he recommissions humanity, sons of Noah, after the flood, repeats the Edenic mandate. Have kids, go out, have dominion, and all this sort of stuff. And so what do? Well, if we go back to Genesis 11, which is the actual Tower of Babel story, the people say to themselves, let's build a tower lest we be dispersed over all the earth. Yeah, lest we obey what God actually told us to do. Well, we don't want to do that, so let's instead build a tower. And you say, well, that seems relatively harmless. Well, basically everybody in biblical studies, agrees that the tower, it's Mesopotamia, Tower of Babel. This is a ziggurat. What's a ziggurat? A ziggurat was one of these artificial mountains, like a step pyramid, and you built one as part of a temple complex. Now, as soon as I say that, you should know what the problem was. A temple complex is where you worship. It has something to do with deity. Okay, what they're doing is they're building a tower essentially to change and reestablish the relationship between them and God. We're going to build the place that God, you can show up here now, and we'll have this relationship. But we're not doing what you said. You need to come here. We're not going to go out there. And God's like, no, that isn't the idea. You don't get to change the parameters of the relationship. And so that's when we get the confusion of the languages and the dispersion groups into these nations. So right away, you've got a situation here where God is not happy. And what he does is he judges humanity not only by fragmenting them, okay, divorcing them essentially, but he says, okay, I'm going to do this. I'm going to create you I'm going to put you into smaller entities according to the number of the sons of God. And remember, verse 9 used that allotment language. God is going to allot to himself Israel, which doesn't exist yet, but it's going to in the next chapter. That's when he calls Abraham, right after Babel. God's going to create a new humanity that is going to be his own. It's not going to be these people anymore. Instead, if we go to Deuteronomy 4, we get another little snippet into this episode. This is the parallel to Deuteronomy 32, 8, and 9. If we go to Deuteronomy 4, 19 and 20, we read something interesting. The language is going to be familiar here. Moses is warning the Israelites against worshiping the sun, moon, and stars. Okay, we've dealt with that language before too. Beware lest you raise your eyes to heaven when you see the sun and the moon and the stars, all the host of heaven, that you be drawn away and bow down to them and serve them, things that the Lord your God has allotted to all the peoples under the whole heaven. So God has made a decision. He has allotted the worship of these sun, moon, and stars. Again, that's language for other divine beings, other celestial beings. He's allotted that worship to those nations, and of course those nations to those beings. He's created a symbiotic relationship. God is divorcing humanity from himself, You don't want me to be your God? You want to try to change the parameters here? Okay, we're done. We're done. I'm going to start over. I'm going to call this guy, this Abram dude over here in Ur of the Chaldeans, and I'm going to start anew with him. His offspring are going to be my people. And he's perfect because he and his wife are past childbearing age. She's not able to have kids. She's absolutely perfect because that family, that new humanity is only going to exist because of my creative ability, my power. That's going to be assigned to everybody else on the planet. So God divorces humanity at Babel. They're fragmented now. They don't have a relationship with the true God. Instead, they have a relationship with these other sons of God, these other celestial beings. Now, if you track this theme through Deuteronomy, you get to Deuteronomy 17. The host of heaven there are called Elohim. We've seen that term before. Okay, way back when we talked about Psalm 82. They're called gods. You get to Deuteronomy 29. You get the allotment language again. Deuteronomy 29, 23 through 26, how God has allotted, created this relationship as a judgment, as a punishment. Israel's not supposed to worship these other Elohim. Okay, they're going to have their own deities. Again, this is a divine punishment of humanity. God cutting himself off from the rest of the human beings. You get to Deuteronomy 32 and you run into verses 8 and 9, again explaining how we got this relationship, how the world became what it is. And in verse 17, you keep reading, in verse 17 we find out that the Israelites fall victim to this. They worship other Elohim. Specifically, let's just go there. We go back to Deuteronomy 32, 17. We have here, they, the Israelites, sacrificed to demons. Shadim is the Hebrew term. It's not the term that we would think of later in the Gospels as demons, like that can possess people. Shadim, Shadu in Akkadian, is actually a name for a territorial entity, which makes perfect sense in Deuteronomy 32, 8 and 9. They sacrificed to demons, okay, not God, to gods, Elohim, they had never known, to new ones, new gods that had come recently, the ESV has, whom your fathers never dreaded. In other words, you're worshiping different gods now than your forefathers did, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. I had my relationship with them. I created Israel to have a relationship with me over against all the other peoples. I allotted them to other members of the heavenly host and vice versa. And now look what you're doing. You're chasing after these other gods. So what Deuteronomy 32, 8, and 9 does, again, the Babel incident, what I call the Deuteronomy 32 worldview associated with the Tower of Babel. And here's why it's the third prong on why the world is a mess. It not only fragments humanity, but it is the reason for idolatry. I think it's a contributing factor. We'll be a little softer on that. But it directly relates to the problem of idolatry. And this is why the rest of the Old Testament, this episode actually frames the rest of the Old Testament. You have Yahweh, the God of Israel, against the other gods. Okay? You have Israel against the other nations. Now, we're not told initially when God appoints the nations to these beings. There's no language in Deuteronomy 32, 8, and 9 necessarily that they're evil or corrupt. We just know that's the way it works out. We know also from Psalm 82. Remember the scene where God is judging the gods in council? He's angry with them for their injustice, for sowing chaos among the nations and all this. And look at the way the psalm ends. The very last verse in Psalm 82 has the psalmist saying, "Arise, O God, and take the nations." Take them back. So this is really important theologically. It's why the Old Testament is what it is. It's why the New Testament is what it is. And this bleeds in the New Testament. Where do you think Paul gets his worldview from? Have you ever noticed that Paul, in 1 Corinthians 10, 21 and 22, when he says, in chapter 8, he said, it's okay to eat the meat sacrificed to idols. If it's sold in the marketplace, don't worry about it because, some people are thinking of gods when they do this, but, we know there's only one God. For us, there's only one God and one Lord, for us. The pagans have their own thing going here. But then when he gets to verse 10, or chapter 10, he says, don't do that. Okay, if it's not sold in the marketplace, don't do it because then you're part of the ritual. And that's dangerous because I don't want you to be worshiping demons. He actually quotes, if you look at what Paul writes and compare it to the Septuagint, Greek translation of the Old Testament, of Deuteronomy 32:17. He quotes Deuteronomy 32:17. Don't do this. Don't do what Israel did, because you're going to be in fellowship with demons. So Paul takes the gods of Deuteronomy 32:17, sons of God, Deuteronomy 32:8-9. He takes them seriously. To him, they're true, satanic, demonic, dark powers. So he says, don't do that. That's one of the few times Paul uses the word demons. Most of the time, and you all know this, what's his vocabulary for the powers of darkness? Principalities, powers, rulers, thrones, dominions. What do all those terms have in common? Geography. They are they're terms of geographical rule, which makes perfect sense in light of the whole Daniel worldview, and of course, Daniel getting it from Deuteronomy 32. This is what Paul's up against. And it makes sense that Paul would use these terms, because why? Paul is the apostle, the one sent to the nations. Of course he's going to be thinking in these modes. This is who he is. It's his mission. So it's important to get back to the original question for a lot of things. This is a big part of the biblical worldview. It's one of 3 reasons why the world is a mess. It's also, again, if you have this in your head, the Messiah is going to deal with all 3 of these things. Genesis 3, Genesis 6, now we've got the Babel episode. And it really informs how we look at the Old Testament in other passages, and again, how we're tracking with Paul in the way he talks about the powers of darkness.
Answering the question of why the world is such a chaotic mess is not an easy thing to do. It is one of the most sought-after questions of all time. But for the first century Jew, that answer was found in 3 distinct threads running through Scripture from Genesis to Revelation. The good news for us is that they all find their resolution in Jesus Christ, the Messiah. The importance of understanding these threads in context helps us see how the rest of the Old and New Testament are framed in the larger biblical worldview.